we're off and running, or as you would like to say, on the record.
Yeah.
How are you, Christian?
I'm well. I hope you are.
Yeah, doing well myself. Little did I know that both of us were going to have some interesting artwork behind us. So we'll have to touch base on that as we go.
Look forward to it. Yes, sir.
Yours is much more interesting because of the pop culture reference. But we'll like I said, we'll delve into that. But thanks very much for doing the episode. I really appreciate it. This is going to be an interesting one. But I also want to thank everybody who's tuning in. If you're a returning visitor, thank you very much. If you're new to this program, did you know that? ? Be sure to hit subscribe with the bell so you're notified as episodes go live on Thursday mornings. My name is Sean O'Rourke. When I am not interviewing interesting people about interesting things, I'm a cyber liability consultant for an insurance brokerage firm in New York City. And Christian, why don't you tell the fine folks who you are and what you do?
Sure. My name is Christian Dysart. I'm a criminal defense attorney in Raleigh, North Carolina. I'm at the law firm Dysart, Willis, Houchin, and Hubbard. We are 7 lawyers, and our firm prides itself on doing everything from minor traffic violations all the way up to first-degree murder and federal work. I've been an attorney since 2007, and we've been excited to watch the firm grow over the last decade or so up to where we are now.
Well, and as folks who have watched previous episodes, one of my objectives with this channel is to sort of dispel myths and bring out the truths about particular, occupations, data points, and what have you. And I think defense attorneys, all most people know about them is whatever they see on TV, whether it be in the news media or other mediums. And so you and I graduated from the same undergraduate university back in block year. And so we know each other through there. But you didn't go right into law. So how did you wind up becoming a defense attorney?
So when I was a senior in undergrad, I thought about going to law school. Decided that the time wasn't right. I came back to Raleigh and worked for my parents for several years in a business that they owned. And my father was very much an entrepreneur, and so I think it's always been in my blood. But I, in high school, was most drawn to those teachers that I had who also were coaches. And I thought that was going to be my destiny. I played football for a year in college, and that was a big part of my childhood. And so I took a job at a school that I hoped would allow me to teach history and coach. They didn't have a football team, and so I started coaching basketball, and then I can skip over the uninteresting parts, but moved into girls basketball and had a lot of success. Won a state championship and really had a good go of it, and parlayed that into an opportunity to be the athletic director and women's basketball coach at a Division III college in Raleigh. I did that for 5 years, but I knew that I needed a long-term plan. And so I went to law school. I didn't start until I was 34, graduated at 37. I did a judicial clerkship and went back to Duke Law and did a 1-year fellowship in their Center for Criminal Justice and Professional Responsibility, mostly doing Innocence Project work and wrongful convictions clinic work, and then opened up my own firm in the spring of 2010.
So that's pretty interesting. Do you think you would have wound up as a defense attorney had you not done the sort of the Innocence Project type work ahead of time?
Well, I think the timing of that is different than your question suggests. So I started law school thinking that I would continue in athletic administration. Most Division I athletic directors have some graduate degree, and many of them have law degrees, because dealing with the NCAA and compliance issues is largely legal work. And so that was what I envisioned when I went to law school, was that I was going to use this as an opportunity to move from Division III athletics. I played at a Division III school. I have 2 children who are at Division III school playing sports now. A third child who will be starting at a Division III school in the fall. So I'm a big believer in Division III athletics, but I thought that maybe an opportunity would exist for me at a bigger school to continue coaching, but also move into athletic administration at a much larger university. And so that was the plan. And that was sidelined because on the very first day of law school, I went to my required criminal law class, and I knew 5 minutes into that class that that's what I wanted to do. And so I then spent the rest of my law school career doing as much work as I possibly could, taking as many courses as were offered, which are few and far between. It's not the typical path for most people with a law degree. And so I had to struggle to find those classes, although I think Duke did a good job of giving me an opportunity to look at it from a constitutional law aspect. I'm sure we'll touch on that as this conversation goes on. But the procedural part, I mean, everything about the criminal law process was fascinating to me. And so my time back at Duke, doing the fellowship and working on the Innocence Project, I was overseeing the student-run Innocence Project teams that I had participated on one of those while I was a student. And so by the time I got that fellowship at Duke, it was because I had dedicated all of my time towards criminal law.
So that's rare, I take it, that somebody finds their path that quickly, even before graduating from law school, is it not?
Yeah, I think so. I certainly think that there are lots of folks who start in law school thinking they're going to save the world, and that they have some avenue to try to do that, and a passion. I did not have that vision when I started law school, but I found it pretty quickly. I think that's right. I mean, there's so many things you can do with a law degree, and this is but one of them. But what I liked most about it, especially given my history in athletics, both as a player and a coach, and in athletic administration, is that it allowed me to have some of that same adrenaline rush that I had as a coach on the sideline.
Sure.
I get from going to court. And so even within the first week of opening my firm in the spring of 2010, I was in court. And during my third year of law school, I did a year-long internship at the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Eastern District of North Carolina. It's a opportunity that I'll forever be grateful for, because it's opened so many doors for me, and it's why my emphasis is on federal criminal law now. But even as a law student, I was getting to go to court, and most of my classmates were not. And so I've known for as long as I can remember that that's what I wanted to do.
That's fantastic, because I'm still trying to figure out what I want to do with my life. So kudos to you for knowing right off the bat. So defense attorneys, we're going to get into some of the pop culture aspects of it. But from your perspective, from what you were taught in law school, what is your primary objective as a defense attorney? Is it to ensure your client gets the fairest trial possible, or is it to get your client a not guilty conviction?
So not guilties are few and far between.
Okay.
Our firm has certainly had our share of success, and we're glad for that. And I would say that if people come to us in part because we're not afraid to try the case, and there are lots of folks, even those who claim that they go to court, who really don't want to be there and aren't comfortable in that environment. And I certainly am, and my law partner, Ryan Willis, certainly is. And so we're willing to try your case, but that's almost never in our client's best interest. The stakes are so high, at least for the work that I do, because most of the work that I do now is either federal criminal defense, murder work, or sex crime work. And so we're talking about folks who are facing decades, if not life in prison. And so my role almost always is to try to level the playing field as much as possible. The resources and the power of either the state or federal government is so great. And so what we see our role in almost every case is to try to level the playing field, as I said, and at least take away the potential disadvantage that everyone going through the criminal justice system has, simply because of the power of the prosecution. Obviously, in every case, irrespective of the charged crime, we are trying to see if we think that we can have the case be dismissed. One of the things I would like for us to talk about is, you hear on TV, dismissed on a technicality. Typically what people mean when they say that is that there were constitutional violations. And so I bristle at the concept of a technicality. We can talk more about that. But so we obviously look to see whether or not we think we can have the case be dismissed. And we certainly advise our clients as to the advisability of whether or not they should take their case to trial. But at that point, and this is obvious, but at that point, we're all in, right? It's all or nothing. And so for the overwhelming majority of our clients, irrespective of the charged crime, we are trying to help them find the best possible landing place, right? We're trying to help them find a soft landing. I have lots of friends who are true believer, pie in the sky, everybody is innocent, and they believe that their clients are all innocent and that they have been unfairly charged. I will say without hesitation that most of the people who hire me are guilty of the crime charged or of something. And we are working together to try to find a resolution that is at least agreeable to all the parties involved. I've heard before, just in the business world or in buying or selling a home, that it's not a good deal unless everybody is dissatisfied, right? And I think that that's probably true in the work that I do as well. It's the best results that we often get for our clients. It's more time than they wanted to spend. It's not as much time as the victims or the prosecution wanted, but again, we can at least find some way that is a reasonable resolution. And just being blunt, for my clients, Ryan's and my clients, we are trying to get them a release date, because often when they come to us, they are facing the very real possibility that they will die in custody. Yeah. And so we are trying to find them a way home. And sometimes that is through filing dispositive motions that might allow their charges to be dismissed and they get to come home soon, or pointing out other flaws with the prosecution's theory that might lead to a reduced or dismissed charge. But sometimes it's just trying to help them from a sentencing standpoint, at least have some light at the end of the tunnel.
Well, and so I have to ask, do you know, or does it matter whether or not your client is guilty or innocent, or not? I don't want to use that phrase.
That's fair.
Have done what they are charged with.
Yep. So the short version is I don't care. And I tell my clients that I don't care. And most of the time I don't ask. Certainly there are times when my client will tell me I did not do what they have accused me of. And that's certainly true in the sex crime setting. Often, especially if there's a child victim, you're dealing with a situation where there's uncertainty as to whether or not the charged crime actually happened. And many of my clients will say, I did not do this. And that's fine. I'm glad to hear their opinion, but it's really irrelevant to the job that I do. The most terrifying thing I think most criminal defense attorneys would tell you is to have an innocent person who is facing the very real possibility of dying in custody. Most of my clients are just quite simply not innocent, and it's rare. We have clients who decide that they want to proceed to trial, and obviously that is their constitutional right, and we're happy to protect them through that process. But I think that even most of them would admit that they're not factually innocent of the charged crime, or at least of all of the charged crimes. And we're going to trial for different reasons other than factual innocence. It happens. We certainly have clients who have persisted in their claim of innocence from the outset, and we take those cases very seriously, but it's not the majority of our cases by a long shot.
So since it doesn't matter to you, how do you keep, because I mean, I'm sure some of the stuff that you've seen has been pretty horrific. How do you keep a dispassionate attitude toward somebody that in your mind is guilty of whatever image or whatever charge that you're seeing or reading on a filing?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a fair question. And I think at the beginning of my career, I probably struggled with it more than I do now. You are correct. The work that I do and that our firm does, many of the charged crimes, especially the homicides and sex offenses, are as horrific as you can possibly imagine. I do try to take a very academic, dispassionate approach to reviewing that discovery. And there are certainly times when it is difficult to do. I have children of my own, right? I have daughters, and so it's heartbreaking. By the time we get involved, there are no winners, right? There is a victim who believes that they have been wronged. There is a defendant who's been charged with the most horrific thing that you can imagine. There are no winners, and so we have to take an not uninterested but dispassionate approach, because otherwise it would cloud my ability to do my job. I'm a very competitive person, and I think that is helpful in what I do, because most of what we do is a very high stakes game of poker, where we are going to opposing counsel in the majority of my cases, that being a prosecutor at the state or federal level, and saying, we don't think you have it, right? Or there are problems with your case. And sometimes that's true, and sometimes we're bluffing, and they are doing the same thing with us, and we are using those potential problems with the case to try to find a reasonable plea offer. And I tell my clients from the outset in just about every case, even if they tell me in the initial consultation that they intend to plead not guilty and are going to trial, that's fine. I'm happy to proceed that way, but I'm not doing my job if I don't get a plea on the table. I
Right.
need that decision that they're making about whether or not they want to go to trial. I want that to be based on an offer in hand. And so irrespective of the crime, we want something. And often for the work that Ryan and I do, we're talking about getting a release date on the table, because when they come to us, there isn't one in sight. And so again, if based on that plea that's been offered, if they say, no, I reject that plea and would proceed to trial, that's fine. But at least then they're making an informed decision, because if you're making that decision about whether or not to proceed to trial in a vacuum, it's an uninformed one at best.
Well, from a strategic standpoint, do you use that offer also to judge how confident the prosecution is in their case?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
And so, and this is the hard part, because again, especially if you're talking about not even so much our clients, because I think our clients are typically realistic about the predicament that they find themselves in, but their family members who are having a hard time even contemplating the thought that their loved one might be guilty of the charged crime or something similar. The problems with the case are often used as bargaining chips, right? And so prosecutors are also competitive, or the majority of them are, but they're also being judged based on their success, right? And a conviction, whether through negotiated plea or after trial, is the end game for them. And so often what we find is, we think you have a problem with this particular aspect of your case, and a jury might believe us, or they might agree with us, and therefore you might lose outright. And so we would ask that you take that into account in coming up with a plea that is discounted because of that potential problem that they have with the prosecution.
Right.
And that's a daily part of my job, is having conversations with prosecutors where we say, you might lose. My client might walk out the back door with me. And so to avoid that, are you willing to put something more reasonable on the table? They'll say yes or no, but typically there is some offer made, and then my client can make an informed decision about whether or not he's willing to take the risk of going to trial. We tell our clients all the time, all we can do at the outset is help you evaluate risk. And our clients, just like in the business world, our clients, some of them are very risk tolerant, some of them are not. And that has to be a factor in the decisions that they make. So
before we get into one of the areas that you already mentioned about leveling the playing field, as a lot of people who watch this channel know, I'm an avowed cynic to a certain extent. So there is no constitutional right of innocent until proven guilty. That's sort of a maxim to sort of fluff up the judicial system, in my opinion. In your opinion, does that exist? Or is somebody guilty until you can show that they may be not guilty?
Yeah, it is definitely the latter. I mean, I appreciate that it is the stated norm, but it is absolutely not the norm. Law enforcement wouldn't have charged the crime if they didn't believe that it had occurred and that our client had committed it. Prosecutors won't persist in the case and in trying the case unless they believe that that our client is guilty of what they've been accused of doing.
How about the general public?
Well,
like your jury pool?
The jury pool absolutely believes that they wouldn't have been charged if something didn't happen. They, even in today's society, and there's healthy skepticism about police, and I get it. But even in that world, I think that most people assume that if someone has been charged with a crime, then they must have done something. Many of the judges, at least on the state court bench, are former prosecutors. And so we often have to deal with, an extra prosecutor in the room, it feels like, from time to time, and that's frustrating. So I agree with you. I think it's too bad, and I can articulate why the innocent until proven guilty is true procedurally and why it's true, at least in name, but it's absolutely not the reality of what I do for a living.
So, and again, everybody knows that we discuss sort of prompt questions
Sure.
prior to the conversation, but this is one.
Can I admit I didn't read them?
That's fantastic. That makes it even better. So that means all your answers are just perfectly natural and not rehearsed. That's plus the fact most of them don't read them. I hardly read them, and I write them. So, but to that end, about the innocent until proven guilty, has your job gotten more difficult with the rise of social media and other avenues of these cases being, I don't know, dramatized, pumped up, whatever phrase you want to use to sort of garner eyeballs on a screen?
Sure. I mean, I can give you a couple of examples. I mean, the answer is yes. So on a granular level, they're more difficult because many of my clients want to brag about the crimes that they've committed and post things on social media that prove the government's case.
Right.
And it's silly, and you and I can laugh about it, but I've had clients who have, flashed the money that they stole from a bank and a close enough shot to show the serial numbers. Right. I have had clients who thought it would be a good idea to post things on social media of them holding a gun when they are prohibited from owning one because of prior convictions or some other restriction. I have had clients who have posted things online, showing the drugs on the table, right? I mean, so these things on a granular level make my job more difficult, certainly. But I can give you another very real world example, and it's a pending case, so I can't get into specifics. But I have a client who is charged ultimately, right this minute, he's charged with selling firearms and firearm parts and sending them across the country. The greater implication in the government's theory is that he's part of a anti-government group. I'm going to avoid any editorialization about what that group might be, but he's part of an anti-government group who was plotting, if not the overthrow of local or state governments in various localities, at least was talking about those kinds of things online, had attended some political rallies over the last year, and his mere presence at those rallies is evidence from the government's perspective about his political views and therefore what he intended to do. And I get it, right? So that the case was difficult from the outset. And then January 6th came and people raided the Capitol building. Yeah. And now I'll never get a reasonable plea in that case. Right. So what was in my mind a relatively straightforward case where there was a lot of smoke, but very little fire beyond the firearm offenses that he was originally charged with. In my mind, it was a pretty straightforward case where they wanted to dramatize it because of their belief that he was a member of a certain organization and therefore that should somehow drive the prosecution. But I don't think our judges want to hear that, right? If you think that a crime has been committed, charge it. Don't tell me that all you have is that he sold some gun parts, but you should sentence him as though he were involved in trying to overthrow the government. And my belief was they didn't have it. But after January 6th, no one's listening to that argument from me anymore, right? So social media and the media at large has made a relatively straightforward case almost impossible. And I've said internally here and to others that I assume now that the case is for trial, because I don't think that the government is going to make a reasonable plea offer. And we're going to be basically trying this case as though my client were at the Capitol on January 6th, and he quite certainly was not.
So again, you've lost control of the narrative simply because of something that happened hundreds of miles away from where your case is being held. So
and with people who are not even no one is even claiming that the people who were at the Capitol on the 6th are part of the same organization or organizations as my client. They are wholesale separate, but it has clouded the entire proceeding.
Right. And I mean, everybody can also see the other side of the story is that the prosecution is now in a tight spot.
Absolutely.
To where if they negotiate with you, well, now they've somehow pseudo blessed whatever happened on the 6th, and they can't do that from a political and possibly a career perspective. So
well, and they don't want to set precedent, right? I mean, so one of the things that we're always dealing with is with every, let's just choose sex crimes in the county, Wake County, where Raleigh is, state capital is, where my office is. You can see the Capitol from my office. The prosecutors here do this every day. And so it's difficult because we come to them and say, in this particular case, we think you have a problem with X, Y, or Z. And what we get in response is, whether they say it outright or it's just implied, is I can't give you what you want because I have 12 other cases that are just like this one.
Right.
The facts are different. The actors are different, but I can't give you what you want because it's going to set precedent that's going to make it more difficult for them to do their job. Right. And so, it's tough. I was in court recently with somebody who had been arrested and the case was in the news, and that's often true for our firm, and we're glad to be there. The media was there with cameras, and I saw one of the cameramen who I know, and I sent him a text and said, "You're not going to get your show today. I'm here by myself." And his response was, "The best lawyers come to court alone." And I said, I agree, right? I had gotten my client excused, right? Because I'm trying to avoid that. Yes. Some of the best work that I do and that my firm does are in cases that no one's ever heard of, cases where no one even knew that there was an investigation, much less a prosecution, because I don't want to try and do this in the limelight. It's not my style. It's not my personality. And I ultimately don't think it helps my clients get the best results.
Yeah, because even if your client is found not guilty or pleads to a lesser charge, the more publicity there is, the tougher the back end of their life may be. Because
Absolutely
more and more
true.
people will recognize them and whatnot. We actually have a situation going on here in New York to where the New York Post posted the wrong picture of somebody that they thought was associated with Purdue Pharmaceuticals, which is a big opioid producer.
Right.
And then CNN picked up the same picture, and John Oliver on his TV show on HBO picked up the same picture. So this guy's picture was all over the place. Well, he sued the Post for that. And he said because of the negative feedback, both to his business and his personal life, he's had to shave his head and grow a beard to try to disguise himself.
Yeah.
From all the negative fallout. And so, I can see why the less publicity, the better for you. So now go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I was just going to say there certainly are other attorneys who think differently, right? And I have seen the media used well. I've seen the media used to the advantage of a criminal prosecution for the defense, but it's not my take.
Okay. So now let's get back into the leveling the playing field, because you are absolutely right. Every defendant is an underdog just by the nature of a state or a federal prosecutor's power and basically unlimited checkbook.
Correct.
So what are the steps, the legal steps that you can take to level that playing field and sort of make the whole process fair for your clients?
So reputation is everything, right? So for everyone at my firm, we pride ourselves in never crossing any ethical line, because we need to be able to go, to the point that we were talking about earlier. When I go to a prosecutor and say, I think you have a problem with this case, I need them to take that seriously, right? We don't cry wolf. We never cry wolf. And so I think it's important for all of the attorneys in my firm to develop a reputation and maintain relationships. It cuts both ways, right? I mean, I've had clients who have absolutely hired us because I have former state and federal prosecutor who are attorneys in my firm. And I've also had clients who have questioned whether that means that we're somehow in cahoots with the state or federal prosecutors because we have those relationships. But I've never gotten a better plea deal from a state or a federal prosecutor because of a professional or a friendship relationship that I have with that prosecutor. I have absolutely gotten better plea deal from friends who happen to be prosecutors because they trust me and they believe me, and they know that when I come to them and say, I think you have a problem and here's how we can fix it, that they'll listen. And so I think a lot of what we do, and everybody has different lanes here, right? So as I said earlier, we handle traffic matters and misdemeanors, but I don't do that, right? I mean, because I wouldn't be the best person for the job. And so we have lawyers who stay pretty focused on their practice area. And I demand of them and encourage them to develop those relationships and to maintain that reputation, because I think that in and of itself helps level the playing field, right? I think that when it is prosecutor versus defendant who they do not know, and all they are viewing that person or basing their opinion of that person on is the charged crime, I think that prosecutors develop a tunnel vision in trying to figure out how to convict that person. And it certainly remains part of the equation. But I think that when we get involved, I think it helps level the playing field a little bit, because it gives the prosecutor somebody to speak openly and to talk frankly with us about the case. And I hope and trust that they'll also listen when we have arguments that we think are valid. And so I think that that's a big part. Ryan's background as a former Wake County district attorney, I think also gives him a prosecutor's point of view, which I think is useful as we evaluate cases, and we're looking at whether or not we think that ultimately all we care about is, if we go to trial, is our client likely to be convicted, right? And so I think Ryan's experience as a former Wake County prosecutor gives him a view of how is the state likely to put on their case. And because he's done that now from both sides of the aisle, I think that is invaluable. One of our attorneys started his career as an FBI agent and did that in the field as an investigative special agent. And then he moved over and was in the antitrust division and was prosecuting antitrust cases, which is fascinating to me. And our firm is actually moving in that direction. We're moving more and more towards trying to do white collar investigative work and away from street crime. And we're excited about that. But then he rounded out his career as a federal prosecutor, right? So he's a great member of our team because he can look at it from the view of law enforcement, having been an FBI agent who was charged with investigating the crime, and as a former federal prosecutor in how he would present a case to a jury. And so I think that we have the right people here, right, who have the kinds of backgrounds and experience that are necessary for us to help evaluate the case. Because again, as I said earlier, a lot of what we do is risk assessment.
Well, from a legal maneuverability or a legality standpoint, are there changes that you would like to see that could make the playing field a little bit fairer? Again, we're not judging people. We're trying to get people fair trials or fair processes.
So it's. I don't know the answer to your question. I mean, let's just cut right to it. I don't know how we fix the system, but the system is definitely broken. If you look around the state or federal courthouses, the overwhelming majority of defendants are minorities. And that is an indication of a broken system in and of itself. But it's also an indication that the system, the education system, the socioeconomic system that's in place in our country is failing at some point. And so I would love to see us try to figure out how to right the ship. I don't know the answer to that. I can tell you that my daughter is applying to law school now, and that is that's her take, right? She wants to try to figure out. There's a story that she tells that I think is interesting, which is, if the problem is, and she's going to be furious with me because I'm going to butcher her story. But the story that she tells is that there are people in the river, right? And there are people who are downstream who are trying to save the people from the river. I am definitely downstream, right? I am absolutely trying to pull people out of the river, and I'm trying to do that, putting out the fire closest to me all day, every day, trying to pull people out of the river. She has said that what she wants to do is keep people from falling in the river in the first place. And That's absolutely a better approach, right? It's not the job that I have, but I applaud her for her passion. And I think that that's right. I think we need to figure out why the system is broken long before people are charged with a crime. Procedurally, I don't have a problem with the way that cases are tried. I don't have a problem with the way that cases are prosecuted. You have hit on, and we've talked already about the fact that the resources are so great for state and federal prosecutors and for law enforcement, and that's an uphill battle. Thankfully, the Constitution guarantees that people are at least allowed to have counsel, right? Yeah. I mean, that's an important part of our system. But I can tell you that it's also a challenge. We do appointed work for in federal court. There's a Criminal Justice Act panel where we are private attorneys who take on those cases that the public defender's office can't handle. And I'm actually the representative for our district and have been for the last 5+ years, selected by the court to kind of be the liaison between those lawyers in private practice who accept indigent work and the court and the public defender's office. And I'm glad to have that role. And it gives me a unique insight into how things are done at the public defender's office and how the court does things. But I can tell you that it's a challenge because my experience, it's not always true, but often my experience is that if I am appointed to represent someone, they don't trust me. They understand that they have a right to appointed counsel, and they don't know anything about me. They had no say in the fact that I am who is going to be representing them, and it creates a trust problem from the outset. Those clients who hire me, and in many cases pay me a ton of money, they have vetted me, they have interviewed me, they have made a conscious decision that they want me to represent them and to fight for their rights. And so the relationship is different. The work that I do for my appointed clients in federal court versus the work that I do for my retained clients is the same, right? I evaluate every case the same. I am proud of the fact that I am going to fight just as hard for either of them because, again, I like to win, right? And one of the things that I want to make sure that we talk about is, I think one of the things that's a challenge for criminal defense attorneys, whether in public service or in private practice, is reevaluating what a win is. I mean, back to a question that you asked earlier, it's very rarely, sometimes, but very rarely is it a not guilty after trial. That is a win, but that is not the norm. Often the win is, I got you home after 4 years instead of 24 years, right? That's a huge win. But again, you have to view it through a different filter. But the work that I do for appointed clients versus retained clients is the same, but the relationships are different.
So I want to ask you, because you've mentioned both state and federal, what's the biggest difference between working a case, defending representing a defendant at the state level versus the federal level?
Sure. So, I mean, the first thing I would say is that the ability of law enforcement to charge a crime is greater at the state level. That is an exaggeration, but it's a good way for us to start the conversation, right? So,
and see, I thought it would have been the exact opposite. That's interesting.
Yeah. Law enforcement at the state level, because they are out and their volume is higher, right? Significantly higher. They are out on the street and they are making charging decisions on a regular basis, almost always without the input of a prosecutor or of anyone with a law degree. They see a crime happen, they arrest someone, and then they let the court sort it out, right? And that's fine. But on the federal side, the assistant United States attorneys are almost always, not always, but almost always involved into the decision making about whether or not to charge someone with a federal crime. So we all learned in grade school and high school that everybody has a right to be indicted by a grand jury, right? This is to make sure that we have at least some entity that is not partisan making a decision about whether or not there's enough, at least probable cause to warrant an arrest.
Sure.
And that's right. But at the state court level, very few prosecutions start by indictment, right? They start with an arrest warrant. And often that means that they are arrested on the street, and it is not until later that there's some judicial determination about whether or not this was actually a crime. At the federal level, that's just not how it works. Federal agents, whether they be members of local law enforcement who are part of a task force doing federal work, or they are sworn federal agents, are in daily communication with, this is our target, this is what I think we have, this is what we don't have, how would you have us proceed? They work together. Sometimes they go out and arrest people in the federal system. It would be by what's called a criminal complaint, right? Which is, we had no choice. We saw this person breaking the law, and so therefore we had to arrest them. But then almost immediately, within a week, they're going to have a probable cause, full-blown hearing in front of a federal magistrate judge to figure out whether or not that's going to stick. And ultimately, almost all the cases are resolved by indictment. But in state court, I feel like there's a whole lot more, let's throw it at the wall and see what sticks. And so, we tell our clients and counsel our clients on a regular basis, by the time you are charged with a federal crime by indictment, the prosecutor is confident that he's going to be able to win at trial. On the state court level, the prosecutors are handed a file that 9 times out of 10 or greater, they knew nothing about it, and they are making a decision about law enforcement's work after the fact.
Gotcha. So do you have a preference on which you prefer to work?
I'd choose to be in federal court 100 times out of 100. It's not even close.
Gotcha.
It's fine. There are advantages in state court. We have a greater say in who is on a jury in state court. We get to be more of that deliberative process of picking a jury.
Yeah.
I'm using air quotes, but I'm not going to bother the viewers by watching me make air quotes. But in state court, we get to pick a jury. In federal court, we get to strike a few. Right? I mean, we certainly have some decision-making capacity, but by and large, the judge picks the jury. After we have gotten rid of a few for cause. But so that process is probably better in state court. But I would much rather be in federal court. This is a good segue. I picture a Pennywise concert that I have over my shoulder and the guns behind me. But state court is rock and roll, right? You show up, and most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, you show up not knowing exactly what's going to happen. You show up for a hearing and it's unclear exactly how it's going to go. You show up for a plea and things can change at the last minute. In federal court, it is much more of a symphony. You know exactly what's going to happen and when, and so you can be better prepared. You can do more research. You can make better arguments because you've had more time to articulate them and to research them and to formulate those arguments. I am very much a rock and roll fan. I go to concerts, and the last year, and please hear from me, and I hope everybody understands that I'm tongue in cheek, but and it's been a hard year for everybody. But I have missed going to concerts like you cannot imagine, right? So that's my thing. I'm very much a rock and roll guy. I love going to punk shows, but I much prefer the kind of steady wins the race of federal court.
So and we're going to move into pop culture simply because of the picture behind you, not the Pennywise picture, but the picture of the guns. We'll explain to everybody what that is.
Sure.
But from your experience, now the media likes to place both sides against the middle. So they go full out when there's a big trial and there's a lot of attention and there's a conviction, what have you, and then they go all out when somebody's been released after being falsely convicted or falsely accused and whatnot. And a lot of times in that falsely accused, you really don't get the full story unless there's some sort of really in-depth investigation after the fact. And a lot of times the media is only interested in it for about a 12-hour cycle, maybe 24 for the local.
Yep.
In your experience, are law enforcement and prosecutors on both levels, are they interested in making sure they get it right, or are they interested more in getting the conviction? And I don't want to get you in trouble. If you tell
fine.
me,
I think it's fair. I mean, I mentioned earlier that I think that there are times when prosecutors have tunnel vision. And when I was doing Innocence Project work and wrongful convictions work at Duke, and it's some of the most rewarding work that I've done. When I was doing that, I certainly had cases where it became clear that the prosecutors involved had ignored competent evidence, either of a defendant's innocence or of someone else's guilt, right? And I can give you real world examples of that having happened, but I want to be crystal clear. I understand that the social norms are changing, and I think that's important. But I think that the overwhelming majority of state and federal prosecutors that I have had any experience with are trying to get it right. I think that they are professional. I think that they have a job to do. I think it is a difficult job. I think they are trying to make good decisions. I think that they, especially in victims' rights cases, they are trying to balance what's right for the defendant with what's best for the victim and the victim's family. I do not share the thought that everyone in law enforcement or everyone in state or federal prosecution is part of the problem. I quite simply do not share that view. I understand why others might have that opinion, but I do not. And in my experience, the overwhelming majority are hardworking government employees who are tasked with an impossible job of trying to figure out after the fact exactly what happened and find a just resolution for everybody involved. And my experience is that they do that professionally, and I don't question their ethics or motivation. Well, and it's I'm going to use that as a segue because one of the topics we discussed before this episode was the effects of the social justice efforts in 2020. Obviously, most people are going to remember 2020 as the year of COVID, but here in the United States, the social justice actions in the spring and the summer were just as big of a story and may actually have longer lasting impacts. What impacts did you see from those events and the events that led to those protests? Yep. Well, and I'm going to add one more piece to that puzzle. I think you're right, and it absolutely had an impact on us that I'm happy to discuss. I'm going to add the election cycle to that list because I think that also is relevant to what's going to happen next. So, as a business owner, right, we had a good start to fiscal year 2020. Things were on a normal track for us, and we were grateful for that. And then around the same time, we had the George Floyd events and the beginning of COVID starting to seep across the country. And those two events happening nearly simultaneously and certainly overlapping with each other meant that police were not making arrests, right? So one of the problems that I acknowledge exists with the criminal justice world is that I believe that racial bias does continue to exist with law enforcement. Not all law enforcement, and many of my friends are state and federal agents, and I think all of them or most of them are trying very hard to do the right thing. But I think that there are times when racial bias bleeds in. And so when we had the overlap of I'm scared to be in physical contact with human beings and the heightened scrutiny on law enforcement regarding racial issues and social justice issues, our second quarter was non-existent because police were not making arrests. U.S. Marshals were not serving indictments or arrest warrants, and our business, like so many, and it's been a hard year for everybody, or it was a hard year for everybody. Our business dried up. The social justice emphasis that existed in the first quarter continued through the summer, as you know, and I'm not going to name every incident that led to that heightened awareness. Sure. But we've had those sorts of things happen before, right? Yep. I mean, when you and I were in school, there were incidents like that, right? Yes. And LA was on fire, right? Yep. So it's not that we've never had those kinds of things happen before, but I think for the better. This time it didn't just happen and then go away, and people are continuing to have that conversation, and I think that's important. COVID continued to mean that arrest numbers were low. I mean, the courts, especially the state courts, basically shut down. There are counties that have not had a trial in over a year, and oftentimes with defendants who are languishing in custody for the entirety of that time. And that is creating a whole host of constitutional issues that have not yet been litigated. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens, right? Because we do still claim that there is a right to a speedy trial. But how does that interplay with a worldwide pandemic where people cannot be in the same room together? And I don't think we know the answer to how that's going to play out. But as we moved into the election cycle, I think that the change in administration, it also means that there is not going to be the emphasis on street crime that there has been in the past at the federal level. So over the last 4 years, there has been an emphasis on what I call statistical crimes, right? So there has been an emphasis on firearm offenses, there has been an emphasis on drug offenses, and there's been an emphasis on immigration offenses. And historically and statistically, those involve minority defendants. Right. And so I anticipate that the new administration is no longer going to have that emphasis on those statistical offenses at the federal level. I think that there is going to be greater scrutiny on big business. This is an ebb and flow, right? Sure. With the change in administration, but I do believe that the new administration is going to go after the Googles and Amazons and Apples of the world. And I think there's going to be a greater emphasis on antitrust investigation and prosecution that we touched on earlier. And that's part of our firm's decision to try to move into that world, is that's where we anticipate, at least for the next 4 years, there's going to be greater opportunity for firms like ours who do have the resources and the manpower to handle big investigations. And we also are trying to be aware of the fact that we have to anticipate that the street level gun, drug, and immigration offenses are not going to continue to be a sustainable business model for us or anybody else.
Well, and it's, I mean, I don't think people realize is that a defense attorney is still a business person. And what you just described is essentially what every business in every sector has to go through, is that Absolutely. They have to read the environment to figure out how the tea leaves are changing and how Yep. you're going to have to change with it. And I hope, if nothing else, people take away that defense work changes just like every other business does.
It does. And I can tell you that we had, I think it's an overused word and one probably not typically associated with criminal defense law firms, but we have pivoted in the past, right? So we saw that there was, even before the beginning of the spring of 2020, we had realized that there was less emphasis on stopping cars, right? So often criminal prosecutions of street crime start with law enforcement stopping a car. Sometimes they have a valid reason to stop that car. Sometimes they don't. And I think that that's a very interesting area of constitutional law. But we had said we need to get away from the emphasis on patrol officers stopping cars. And so we had de-emphasized doing driving offenses, de-emphasized doing driving while impaired offenses, and had moved our practice towards doing more and more federal criminal defense because, again, to your point, the numbers were up, right? So we saw that there were more prosecutions than there had been under the Obama administration for street crime. And so it would have been crazy for us not to try to capitalize on that. Yep. And we have been talking now for, we hired Jim Kurasad, who's the former FBI agent and former antitrust DOJ prosecutor. We hired him in the midsummer of 2019 with an eye towards what's going to happen with the election cycle in November of 2020. And what's that going to mean after the administration changes in March or April, not the presidential administration, but the U.S. attorneys, right? We still don't have an attorney general, and at least unless you tell me something happened before I got on this call. But
not that I saw.
Yeah. So, the word on the street is that we're not going to have new United States attorneys appointed in any district until we have an attorney general. And so, we have now been in the middle of a 2-year lead up to what we hope is going to be an increase in white collar and antitrust investigation. Right. So we predicted, and hope we're right. We don't know yet, but we predicted that there might be a change in administration, and that might mean that there was greater scrutiny on big business, and there might be more white collar investigative work. And so we hired 2 lawyers in the late summer and early fall of 2019 in hopes that 6 months from now, there might be business coming. And right. So I think that we've done an okay job, and I'm proud of the fact that we have tried to predict, where things were going. We don't always get it right. But we are.
Well, you also couldn't plan for a global pandemic to throw a whole year curveball at everybody.
That's absolutely right.
Okay, so we're going to close this out with some fun, and the first fun part is actually wasn't planned. It's just because I saw it behind you and I recognized from whence it originated. But please explain to all those who were born later than you and I were what that picture of the guns represents behind you, because it is one of those cult classics that everybody should see.
Yeah, it is. And so you can see it in all its glory. Well, we also have the air purifier now, which, it is the 21st century. So it is. And so everybody needs to see Boondock Saints. Yep. I highly recommend it if you have the stomach for it. Trigger warning, right? It's graphic. But I take pride in the fact that we are not your typical law firm. Our walls, not just in this conference room, but throughout, are covered with concert posters and what my wife calls ridiculous things, including the Truth and Justice, Boondock Saints reference that I have behind me. When I bought that, she said, "What did you buy again?" I said, "I bought the biggest canvas I could find that had these guns." And she said, "And why is that?" I said, "Because a few people like Sean will get it and think that it's funny." And so we have fun. We work really hard around here. Sure. And it's very stressful. I mean, you alluded to it earlier, but it's overwhelming at times. The content of what we do, the content and subject matter of what we deal with every day is really difficult. We just today had, a young woman who was sentenced to a lengthy time of active sentence in prison here in North Carolina. And, both her mother and the victim's mother were in the courtroom, and it was very emotional and it's tough. But we work such long hours that I felt I must have things on the wall that make me happy.
That's
and
good.
So we have worked hard to do that.
Well, kudos on your taste in artwork,
well, thank you.
Regardless of what your wife says. So now I want everybody to realize that defense attorneys are human beings. They're not caricatures made up by either TV, movies, or other mediums. That said, there are some very famous defense attorneys, for good or for bad, in various forms of media. And I want your opinion on ones that you think, I don't want to say accurately, let's say best represent your industry, and the ones that you think are the most ridiculous.
Well, there are plenty that are ridiculous, right? So first of all, everybody needs to watch Breaking Bad because it's good television. And Saul is a caricature, but an entertaining one, right? And so I encourage people to watch that again if they have the stomach for it.
That's one of the best TV series of all time. So
totally agree. So, but what I would say is, and this is sort of not answering your question, but I hope you'll accept it as an answer. The only thing that The Wire gave short shrift to was the defense lawyers, right? Mm-hmm. And so I wish that they had spent more time on that particular aspect in looking into the defense lawyers and how they interacted with those folks in Baltimore. I wish that they had done a better job of that. But The Wire is the closest to what I do of any show that or a movie that has, at least that I've seen. It's a slow burn. A friend of mine once described deep sea fishing to me as hours and hours of boredom interrupted by a few minutes of sheer terror. Yeah. And I think that that's a good description of The Wire and of the work that I do. I really encourage people because, again, I think it shows the bureaucracy. I think it shows the politics that are involved, for better or for worse. I think it shows the inner office. I mean, the most fascinating thing about The Wire to me is we have the hierarchy and the inner workings of the police department and the hierarchy and the inner workings of the, criminal gang. And it's the same, right? Everybody's dealing with the same problems. If I could get everybody I know to watch The Wire, I would have them do that. It is, I will tell you now, everyone who's watching, you've got to give it a few episodes before you get it. But it's as close to what I do for a living and on a daily basis as anything that's out there.
Well, and to The Wire's credit, nothing is resolved by the end of each episode.
Correct.
In fact, very few things are ever resolved.
Arguably after 5 seasons, right? Arguably after 5 seasons, things are not resolved.
Exactly, which just mimics real life, which is what made it so brilliant and also such a cult deal. It wasn't hugely popular because people were, okay, I want a Perry Mason. I want them to get the client off and be done with it, and we move on to the next case. Where this showed, you go years, you go forever. In some instances, and never get the kind of resolution that you're looking for.
The case that we resolved in court earlier today, the crime happened in 2017.
Yeah. And
so you have a young woman and her family who have been waiting for nearly 4 years to find out what it means for our client. And on the other side, you have a victim's mother who has been waiting for 4 years for some sense of finality after pretty horrific crime. Yep. And so it's that's absolutely right. I mean, I think by saying watch The Wire, what I'm also saying is that the CSI, 47 minutes of television, everything is wrapped up in an hour, and the guilty person confesses. That's almost never the reality of the situation. And the other thing that I would say about the CSI shows, and they're certainly entertaining, but it has created a problem with juries because they think that every case has the forensics, and very few of them do. And so instead, cases are tried about people, and people make mistakes, and it's never neatly wrapped up, and there's always uncertainty, and that's where we come in.
Well, I'll tell you what, this has lived up to expectations for myself. I certainly hope it lived up to expectations for everybody who's watching, but this was fantastic. And we didn't even get into, I really wanted to start talking about the political aspects of prosecutions and law enforcement and what have you, but we'll save that for a second episode.
I hope you'll have me
That's
back.
in and of itself is an hour or a day-long conversation.
Well, I'd love for you to invite me back. I really enjoyed this, and I hope those who are watching did as well. And maybe we give it 6 months or a year, and let's see whether or not the change in administration and the social justice issues that continue to be hot topic, whether or not they actually mean any real change.
Well, I'll tell you what, I will put a tickler in my calendar to remind myself, because that's a great idea. But Christian, it was great seeing you, even if it's not in person. But I really thank you for doing this, because I know you've got a busy schedule, and we're going to have to exchange concert and movie ideas.
I love it. That sounds great. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Not a problem. I appreciate it as well. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in. I hope you found this as enjoyable as I did, and as interesting and enlightening for an industry that I think that gets a bad rap in a lot of ways. And I wanted Christian on here because I know he takes his job seriously and he does it well. So again, you've been watching Did You Know That? ? We release episodes every Thursday. So if you want to be reminded when new episodes come on, make sure you hit the subscribe button with the bell. See my finger? I'm pointing to the bell. Make sure you click it. And if you've liked this episode, be sure to give us a like. So for Christian Dysart, my name is Sean O'Rourke. Thanks again for tuning in, and you all take care.